Edward Giles was 15 years old when he enlisted to fight in the Great War, and about 6 months later he was dead. So too his best mate, James Harrington, on that dreadful battlefield of Pozières in France. Giles is the youngest man from WA killed in that war and one of more than 5,200 West Australians who died as a result of their service on the Western Front. You always have to repeat those numbers because they are so large. Why do we know these figures? Well, it's the result of nearly 3 years of work, many, many volunteers who've compiled the first comprehensive list of West Australians who served, and they also discovered that I think about 180 names were missing from the State War Memorial. This with regard to the Western Front. Historian Shannon Lovelady drove the project, as she'd done previously with those West Australians who fought at Gallipoli. This sounds like someone's life's work. Shannon, hello to you.
Hello, Geoff. How are you?
Good. Shannon, you have learnt so much about so many service personnel. Is there someone that you are remembering today?
So many. And probably one of the first, I would say, is one who survived. And he's 3rd Pioneer Battalion Private Archie Irving. He was from Kojonup, and his name's not on the War Memorial, but as I say, that's because he survived the war. He lost his brother, 11th Battalion Sergeant Herbert Irving, at Bullecourt in 1917, but Archie subsequently wrote the most beautiful, heartbreaking, eloquent World War I poems, through which we can clearly see the unending sorrow and anguish that the survived felt for years afterwards. So I think about him a lot and his beautiful poetry. And there are several from that list who are not on the War Memorial. One of those is Percy Rodriguez. He was a lieutenant with the 23rd Battalion. And he was actually the first white boy born in Broome, purportedly. And he comes from one of the most fascinating families I've ever researched. And I think an entire book should be written on them one day, that's for sure.
Can you tell me about the Western Front project, but then your interest in sort of galvanising the small pieces of information that existed and saying we need to know who all these people, who all these West Australians were in this field of conflict and this field of conflict and this one. Why did you want to do it?
Well, it struck me years and years ago, more than 25 years ago, when I was researching our family history, and I came across my husband's great-grandfather, Jim Craig, who was a corporal with the 48th Battalion. And his story was heartbreaking, and he left a pregnant wife. He lied about his age to get in. He really shouldn't have fought at all. And I learnt in researching him a very frightening figure, and that was 5,533 casualties. And while that's not as high as the 8,141 at Gallipoli, those Gallipoli casualties were over 8 months, whereas that 5,533 were in 24 hours on the Somme.
Yeah.
So I just thought, why are we not focused on the Western Front and particularly those horrendous losses?
And I've also seen it written, and correct me if I'm wrong, that more West Australian-born soldiers were fighting on the Western Front than had at Gallipoli. Is that right?
That's right. Both projects unearthed some fascinating statistics, and from the Gallipoli project we learnt that most of the soldiers killed were born in either England or Victoria, in that order. But for the Western Front there was a shift, and they were mostly born in WA.
Some of them you can identify comparatively quickly. Tell me what was difficult about finding the others, and what did you uncover about individuals that enabled you to piece together, this was him, this is what happened, and this is why his name should be on a war memorial?
Well, one of the ones that was the hardest to identify, and in fact we only identified him at the end of last year, was F.A. Clune, and he appears on the Royal Australian Navy panel of the Estate War Memorial. And he had us stumped, and I had our best researchers on him for years, I would say. Everybody kept putting him to the end of their list because he was just too hard to identify. As it was, Deb Martin finally put together the pieces in that he was actually born Sheedy, but his mother had married Clune, and he appeared as Sheedy on the plaque, but she had also put him under Clune. So he was the same person, but just with two different surnames.
So one of the names that has come up is Private Bert Evans.
Oh, yes.
Who is Bert to you?
Bert is somebody I wrote about, and his story is still with me. I think that he has one of the saddest stories I've ever researched, and I would like to do something about redressing that, but maybe next year or later this year.
Tell us about him then.
He grew up in Queensland, and he was the youngest of many children of Queensland hoteliers. And as such, he grew up running around the billiard rooms and the public bar and all of that. And after his parents died, he came here and lived with his older brother, Robert. Now, Robert was about 20 years older, so he was more like a father than a brother. And by the time he got here, he'd been brawling. He was caught. He was a bit of a scallywag. And he enlisted in the 28th Battalion. And he met his best friend there, Roy Graham. And on the Western Front, after service at Gallipoli, they were both seconded to or volunteered for the battalion bombers with the 28th Battalion. And that was horrifying work beyond the front lines in no man's land, lying there as thousands of shells screamed above their heads, cutting the lethal German barbed wire so that we didn't die on it the next day. And they did that time and time again. And Bert lost his friend Roy on the 28th of June because Roy made the fatal mistake of looking up over the edge of the trench and a sniper took him out. He fell dead at Bert's feet, and then a second or two later, Bert was launched into action in a 2-hour action that cost 200 lives from the 28th Battalion, West Australian lives.
Yeah.
There was no time to pause, no time to reflect, no time to grieve at all. And he was wounded again a couple of weeks later and again a couple of weeks after that, and ill health and so on. He eventually was taken out of the front lines and he spent the rest of his war in Calais at the animal hospital. But in 1919, he drank his way back to Australia. He arrived here and was admitted to hospital in Fremantle with delirious tremens, auditory hallucinations and general debility and depression, which we would now pinpoint as PTSD.
Of course.
And he was transferred to Stromness, which was a beautiful home in Mosman Park that catered specifically to soldiers with psychiatric injuries. So Bert spent a few months there, and with his physical injuries healed, he was released. But his psychiatric injuries just festered, and in November that year, he actually lay his life on the line for the last time in front of an oncoming train at Victoria Street train station in Mosman Park and died the next day, a horrible death. And then I visited his grave. I didn't do that for all of the ones I either wrote about or researched, but
Yes.
for Bert, he really got to me. And when I found his grave, I just about cried because there was nothing there.
Whereabouts is that?
In Karrakatta.
Yeah.
I went to the office, which was still open at the time, and they said to me that there had never been a headstone placed there at all. Now, I would say this is because his brother Robert believed his death to be from alcoholism and his behaviour post-war, rather than the PTSD that we know it to be today. So, yeah, he's just always lain in a bare grave, unrecognised.
Is that what has motivated you and all these volunteers? As we say today, who are you remembering, and put a name to that person, because some of these names may not have been publicly uttered for generations. So you get to see what they've had to endure, and then you get to look into what their lives may have been like upon their return. And for some of them, of course, it was a miserable, miserable life, and everything has been wiped. Everything has been wiped away. Any memory of those people is gone, and you're trying to bring them back.
Yeah, I think in the spirit of lest we forget, because Bert deserves to be remembered. And when I say he deserves to be remembered, he's one of the names that is not on the war memorial. So his death was not considered to be a consequence of his war.
So let's talk about this. Shannon Lovelady is my guest, Perth historian. Also, you're now the Secretary of the Claremont RSL.
I am.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Your endeavours are obviously well noted among our audience. You've been part of these pretty enormous projects to name all the West Australians who have fought in these places. To those who've lost their lives either during the war or afterwards, you have sought to find a place for them at the War Memorial. Now, the word from the RSL has been, yes, absolutely, we want them. What stands in the way? Because I sense we're at 180 from the Western Front.
Oh, from both.
From both.
Yep.
From the Western Front and Gallipoli. You are going to do a Middle Eastern project.
Yep.
So there are going to be more from the Middle Eastern project too, I would imagine.
The research from that's already been done. We're just doing the counting as to who's eligible for being considered eligible for dying in that theatre.
Okay.
So,
how then do you make this happen?
well, I was bowled over by the support from the RSL, and as you know, John McCourt said, come hell or high water.
He did.
Those names will go on the memorial, which just delighted me and the whole team. And I think fundraising has already begun, but there is a problem in that our names are etched in marble. And I actually emailed the Australian War Memorial, and Brendan Nelson very kindly sent the Australian War Memorial's policy to me about their kind of additions and amendments. But theirs is a little easier because it's on cast bronze. Each of their panels is one sheet of cast bronze.
Yes.
So when they have one amendment, they'll do it in situ, but when they have more than one like we do, they'll recast the entire sheet. But in our case, with that inscribed marble, that's a trade that's largely gone by the wayside.
Yes.
And is very, very expensive to have done now. So with those 183 additions, there are also 150 amendments that need to be made to it. So there's over 300.
It's going to be a huge headache.
Yeah.
But it has to be done.
So
a way has to be found for it to be done.
I think so. If we're going to have an accurate record on our state war memorial, yes.
Shannon Lovelady, can you tell me of what you are most proud in these years of study and research? And I know it's not just you and lots of splendid volunteers. Is it the bringing back to life something we thought had been lost?
There is that. I've never had a bad reception from a phone call. I've made some pretty weird phone calls in my
Give me
line
an
of work.
example.
I'll ring someone and say, you are the great-granddaughter or you are the great-grandniece of this soldier. And they'll say, no, I don't think I am. And I'll go, well, you are, but let me explain.
Yeah, let's
how.
just get on with it. You are.
I never make a call. I don't know who I'm talking to. And I'll explain, and they'll weep on the other end of the phone. They want to know this story. They want to honour their relative. I'm very proud of that. And I know our whole team is proud of that, but I think probably the thing that we are all most proud about is the fact that Western Australia is the only state to know these numbers because the other states haven't done this kind of in-depth research.
And I would imagine, Shannon, that once you start, you kind of can't stop until it's done.
I'm very task-oriented, yes. Some people might call it OCD. But, I think that's very good for mass data, and I'm very good with mass data. So, yeah, if you want a job done, someone like me is the way to go.
I would think there's not much doubt about that, Shannon. It's a great pleasure having you in today, and thank you for what you're doing because it's so important and it adds texture and meaning to the history of this place and to the significance of this day. So thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.